The Wasp Factory, Chapter 4, Part 7. I was lucky, again. Nobody saw anything, nobody could believe that I had done it. I was distracted with grief this time, torn by guilt, and Eric had to look after me while I acted the part to perfection. Though I say it myself, I didn't enjoy deceiving Eric, but I knew it was necessary. I couldn't tell him I'd done it because he wouldn't have understood why I'd done it. He would have been horrified and very likely never have been my friend again. So I had to act like the tortured, self-blaming child, and Eric had to comfort me while my father brooded. Actually, I didn't like the way Diggs questioned me about what had happened, and for a few moments I thought he might have guessed, but my reply seemed to satisfy him. It didn't help that I had to call my father uncle and Eric and Paul cousins. This was my father's idea of trying to fool the policeman about my parentage in case Diggs did any asking around and discovered that I didn't exist officially. My story was that I was the orphaned son of my father's long-lost younger brother and only staying on occasional extended holidays on the island while I was passed from relative to relative and my future was decided. Anyway, I got through this tricky interval, and even the sea cooperated for once, coming in just after the explosion and sweeping away any telltale tracks I might have left an hour or more before Diggs arrived from the village to inspect the scene. Mrs. Clamp was at the house when I got back, unloading the huge wicker hopper on the front of her ancient bike, which lay propped against the kitchen table. She was busy stuffing our cupboards, the fridge, and freezer with the food and supplies she had brought from the town. "Good morning, Mrs. Clamp," I said pleasantly as I entered the kitchen. She turned to look at me. Mrs. Clamp is very old and extremely small. She looked me up and down and said, "Oh, it's you, is it?" and turned back to the wicker hopper on the bike, delving into its depths with both hands, surfacing with long packages wrapped in newspaper. She staggered over to the freezer, climbed onto a small stool by its side, unwrapped the packages to reveal frozen packs of my beef burgers, and placed them in the freezer, leaning over it until she was almost inside. It struck me how easy it would be to... I shook my head clear of this silly thought. I sat down at the kitchen table to watch Mrs. Clamp work. "How are you keeping these days, Mrs. Clamp?" I asked. "Oh, I'm well enough," Mrs. Clamp said, shaking her head and coming down off the stool, picking up some more frozen burgers and going back to the freezer. I wondered if she might ever get frostbite. I was sure I could see little crystals of ice glinting in her faint mustache. "My, that's a big load you've brought for us today. I'm surprised you didn't fall over on the way here." "You won't catch me falling over." Mrs. Clamp shook her head once more, went to the sink, reached up and over while on tiptoes, turned on the hot water, rinsed her hands, wiped them on her blue check bright nylon work coat, and took some cheese from the bike. "Can I make you up a cup of something, Mrs. Clamp?" "Not for me," Mrs. Clamp said, shaking her head inside the fridge, slightly below the height of the ice-making compartment. "Oh, well, I won't then." I watched her wash her hands one more time while she started sorting out the lettuce from the spinach. I took my leave and went up to my room. We ate our usual Saturday lunch, fish with potatoes from the garden. Mrs. Clamp was at the other end of the table from my father instead of me, as is traditional. I sat halfway down the table with my back to the sink, arranging fish bones in meaningful patterns on the plate, while Father and Mrs. Clamp exchanged very formal, almost ritualized pleasantries. I made a tiny human skeleton with the bones of the dead fish and distributed a little ketchup about to make it look more realistic. More tea, Mr. Culham? Mrs. Clamp said. No, thank you, Mrs. Clamp, my father replied. Francis, Mrs. Clamp asked me. No, thank you, I said. A pea would do for a rather green skull for a skeleton. I placed it there. Father and Mrs. Clamp droned on about this and that. I hear the constable was down the other day, if you don't mind me saying so, Mrs. Clamp said, and coughed politely. Indeed, my father said, and shoveled so much food into his mouth he wouldn't be able to speak for another minute or so. Mrs. Clamp nodded at her much salted fish and sipped her tea. I hummed, and my father glared at me over jaws like heavy wrestlers. Nothing more was said on the subject. Saturday night at the Caldham Arms, and there I stood, as usual, at the back of the packed, smoke-filled room at the rear of the hotel, a plastic pint glass in my hand full of lager, my legs braced slightly on the floor in front of me, my back against a wallpapered pillar, and Jamie the dwarf sitting on my shoulders, resting his pint of heavy on my head now and again, and engaging me in conversation. What you been doing then, Frankie? Not a lot. I killed a few rabbits the other day, and I keep getting weird phone calls from Eric, but that's about all. What about you? Nothing much. How come Eric's calling you? Didn't you know? I said, looking up at him. He leaned over and looked down at me. Faces look funny upside down. Oh, he escaped. Escaped? Shh. If people don't know, there's no need to tell them. Yeah, he got out. He's called the house a couple of times, and he says he's coming this way. Diggs came and told us the day he broke out. Christ, are you looking for him? So Angus says, hasn't there been anything on the news? I thought you might have heard something. Nope. Geez. Do you think they'll tell people in the town if they don't catch him? Don't know. I would have shrugged. What if he's still into setting dogs on fire? Shit. And those worms he used to try to get kids to eat. The locals will go crazy. I could feel him shaking his head. I think they're keeping it quiet. Probably they think they can catch him. Do you think they'll catch him? Oh, I couldn't say. He might be crazy, but he's clever. He wouldn't have got out in the first place if he hadn't been, and when he calls up, he sounds sharp but bonkers. You don't seem all that worried. I hope he makes it. I'd like to see him again, and I'd like to see him get all the way back here because, and I took a drink. Shit, I hope he doesn't, because any aggro, he might. That's all I'm worried about. He sounds like he might still not like dogs an awful lot. I think the kids are safe, though, all the same. How's he traveling? Has he told you how he's intended to get here? Has he any money? He must have some to be making the phone calls, but he's stealing things mostly. God, well, at least you can't lose remission for escaping from a loony bin. I said. The band came on, then a group of 4 punks from Iverness called the Vomits. The band came on, a group of 4 punks from Iverness called the Vomits. The lead singer had a Mohican haircut and lots of chains and zips. He grabbed the microphone while the other three started thrashing their respective instruments and screamed. My girlfriends left me and feel like a bum. I lost my job and when I was wank can't come. I nestled my shoulders against the pillar a little more firmly and sipped from my glass as Jamie's feet beat against my chest with the howling, crashing music thundered through the sweaty room. This sounded like it would be fun. During the interval, while one of the barmen was taking a mop and bucket to the front of the stage where everybody had been spitting, I went up to the bar to get some more drinks. The usual, said Duncan behind the bar. Jamie nodded. And how's Frank? Duncan asked, pulling a lager and heavy. Okay, and yourself, I said. Getting along. You still wanting bottles? No thanks, I've got enough for my home brew now. We'll still see you in here, though, will we? Oh, yes, I said. Duncan reached up to hand Jamie his pint and took mine, putting the money down at the same time. Cheers, lads, Duncan said as we turned and went back to the pillar.